There is a contract you signed without reading it. You were around 22 years old. Maybe younger. Someone handed you a start date, a salary figure, and a benefit summary. You signed it because that is what you were supposed to do. That is what everyone did. That is what the entire previous decade of your education had been quietly preparing you to do. What nobody mentioned was the second clause. The clause that said, in exchange for this income, you will give this organization the majority of your waking hours, your sharpest mental energy, and the best decades of your physical life. You will do this 5 days out of every 7. You will do it for approximately 45 years. And at the end, if the math works out and the market cooperates and nothing unexpected happens, you will be permitted to stop. That is the deal. Not a bad deal, necessarily, but a deal worth understanding before you spend 4 decades inside it. Here is what makes this conversation urgent right now. The traditional employment contract was built for a different economy. One where a single income could support a family. Where a pension arrived automatically after 30 years of service. Where the cost of housing, healthcare, and education consumed a manageable fraction of a household's earnings. That economy no longer exists. The median home price in the United States in 1980 was roughly 3 times the median annual household income. Today, that ratio in many major cities sits closer to 10, 11, even 12 times income. Housing alone has fundamentally repriced what the standard employment path can actually deliver. Meanwhile, the pension has nearly vanished. In 1983, more than 60% of private sector workers had a defined benefit pension plan. By 2022, that number had fallen below 15%. The retirement risk, the question of whether you will have enough, was quietly transferred from corporations to individuals over 4 decades, with almost no public announcement and very little discussion at the time. The 9 to 5 is not a trap because it is immoral. It is a trap because the mathematics of it have changed, and most people are still behaving as if it is 1975. So let us understand the mechanics of the trap before we talk about the exit. The core structure of traditional employment is straightforward. You trade time for money at a fixed rate. Your employer sets the rate, usually within a narrow band for your role and level. You can negotiate within that band, occasionally move to the next band through promotion, and supplement with overtime or a second job. But the fundamental mechanism does not change. More time in, more money out. Less time in, less money out. This structure has a ceiling. It has a floor. And it has an invisible cost that most salary calculators do not show you. Your employer is not paying you what you are worth. They are paying you the minimum required to keep you from leaving. That is not cynicism. That is supply and demand applied to labor markets. The moment a more efficient or cheaper alternative to your role exists, the price of your labor adjusts. This is the same logic applied to any commodity. You are, in that framework, a commodity. The gap between what you generate for your employer and what they pay you is called surplus value in economics. In plain English, the profit margin on your labor. Every business survives on it. The entire employment model depends on it. And the larger that gap, the more profitable the relationship is for one side of the equation. That is not an accusation. It is arithmetic. Now here is where the trap tightens. Most people respond to the ceiling on their income by spending up to the ceiling. A raise arrives, and within 18 months, lifestyle expenses have expanded to consume it entirely. A promotion comes, and a newer car, a larger apartment, a better restaurant tab follows shortly after. Economists call this lifestyle inflation. It is arguably the single most effective mechanism keeping educated, employed, well-compensated people economically trapped, because it does something subtle and devastating. It raises the floor. Every new expense that becomes a recurring commitment raises the minimum income you need to sustain your life, which raises your dependence on your employer, which reduces your negotiating leverage, which quietly tightens the grip of the employment relationship, not because your employer is holding you, but because your own monthly obligations are. By the time the average professional is in their mid-30s, they have built a cost structure that requires their salary to continue, not to thrive, not to save aggressively, simply to continue. The mortgage, the car payments, the childcare, the subscriptions, the dinners out, each one individually reasonable, collectively a cage. The cage is not locked from the outside. It is maintained from the inside. That is the uncomfortable part. The people who escape this trap are not, in the majority of cases, entrepreneurial geniuses. They are not necessarily the smartest in the room or the hardest working. They are the ones who solved a different problem than everyone else. While most people are optimizing their income, the people who escape are optimizing their exit cost. Exit cost is the amount of money your assets need to generate each month to make your employer optional. Not replace your salary. Not match your lifestyle. Simply make the act of continuing to show up a choice rather than a requirement. That number is different for every person. But the calculation is always the same. Take your monthly essential expenses. The real ones, stripped of everything optional. Multiply by 12 to get your annual requirement. Divide by 0.04, the commonly used safe withdrawal rate. The result is your financial independence number. The portfolio size at which your money generates enough to cover your costs indefinitely. If your essential monthly expenses are $3,500, your annual requirement is $42,000. Divide by 0.04 and your financial independence number is $1.05 million. That is not a fantasy number. It is not a billionaire number. It is an engineering target. A specific, calculable destination that most people never identify because they have never been given the framework to ask the question. Now let us talk about the path, because the path is where the hype machine has done the most damage. The internet is full of escape narratives. The person who quit their job to travel the world on passive income. The 28-year-old who retired early through real estate. The freelancer who replaced their 9-to-5 salary in 90 days. These stories exist. Some of them are even true. Most of them are missing the decade of groundwork that preceded the dramatic exit. The boring truth is that escaping the traditional employment trap almost always follows the same structural sequence. It does not usually involve a single brilliant move. It involves an extended, unglamorous period of building before the freedom becomes available. That period has 3 components, and they run simultaneously. First, compress the gap. Drive your savings rate to the highest level you can sustain without collapse. Not a comfortable level. A strategic level. The difference between saving 10% and saving 30% is not a quality of life adjustment. It is a decade of working life. Save at 10% and financial independence might be 30 or 40 years away. Save at 30% or higher and that timeline compresses dramatically, sometimes to 15 years or less, depending on your starting conditions. Second, build the asset base. The money you are not spending needs to go somewhere that grows. Not a savings account earning 1.2% while inflation runs at 4%. Into ownership. Stocks. Real estate. A business with genuine equity value. The specific vehicle matters less than the fundamental principle. You need to own things that generate returns, not just store value. Third, reduce the exit cost. Not just the financial target, but the actual lifestyle architecture. Every recurring expense you eliminate permanently reduces the size of the portfolio you need to become free. This is the piece most financial content avoids, because it requires making real choices about what your life actually needs versus what it has simply accumulated. Here is the part of this conversation that tends to make people uncomfortable in a specific way. The 9-to-5 is not just a financial arrangement. For a lot of people, it is an identity. It provides structure, social connection, a sense of purpose, daily meaning. The office is where they see most of the people they consider friends. The job title is part of how they introduce themselves at parties. The performance review is the primary feedback mechanism through which they understand their own value. Leaving that system, even if the numbers work, is not just a financial transition. It is a psychological one. And the reason so many people who could leave do not is not that they cannot do the math. It is that they are not sure who they are without the structure. A 2019 study published in the British Medical Journal found that early retirees, even those with sufficient financial resources, reported higher rates of depression and social isolation in the years immediately following departure from full-time work than in the years preceding it. The freedom people had been working toward turned out, for many, to be more complex and more disorienting than expected. This is not an argument for staying in a bad employment arrangement. It is an argument for building a destination, not just an escape. Which brings us to the part most financial channels skip entirely, because it does not convert to a product or a course. The question underneath all of this is not, how do I get out of my job? It is, what am I building toward? Because the people who make the transition successfully, who genuinely reach financial independence and use it well, are not running away from something. They are building toward something specific. A business they want to grow. A creative project that requires sustained time. A way of contributing that the standard employment model never had room for. The 9-to-5 trap is not primarily financial. The financial constraint is real and serious and worth solving methodically. But the trap beneath the trap is the unexamined assumption that employment is the default shape of a working life, and that freedom means the absence of it. Some of the most financially free people alive are working harder than anyone in a traditional job. They have simply made their labor optional, which changed the nature of the relationship entirely. So here is where this ends. The path out of the 9-to-5 trap is calculable. The steps are documented. The math is accessible. The timeline, while not quick, is not out of reach for a large fraction of people earning a median income in a developed country who start early enough and stay consistent long enough. And yet most people reading about this right now will not materially change their financial behavior in the next 12 months. Not because the information is wrong. Not because the strategy is flawed. But because between knowing the exit and taking the first step toward it, there is something that finance videos cannot give you. The question is not whether the trap is real. It clearly is. The question is not whether the exit exists. It clearly does. The question, the one nobody can answer for you, is whether the life on the other side of that exit is actually something you have imagined clearly enough to work toward it. Because if it is not, the cage stays comfortable. And comfortable cages are the hardest ones to leave.